Okay. And with that, we have just a simple slide to introduce our speaker this month. So we have Joshua Chenoweth, and he's going to be discussing revegetating the area after the Klamath Dams are taken out. So this is a pretty big, I don't have his bio. So Joshua, I hope that you'll be able to give your own bio there, because I don't have that information here. But this is a huge project, and I know that I'm very interested about it. It's like another world over there, and they have some 2,000 acres that they're going to be revegetating as these dams come out. So I'm looking forward to this. I am gonna stop my screen share, and oops. And Joshua, if you wanna
sure.
So share your screen.
I can take it from here. Let me get that started. So yes, my bio. In a nutshell, I'll try to be quick.
No pressure.
I used to work in television up until I was 30 years old in New York City. I hated it. In about 1997, while I was working in television, I started a garden in my backyard in Brooklyn, New York. I went to Brooklyn Botanic Gardens for a horticulture certificate, and that's when I got hooked with plants. I transformed my backyard and decided I wanted to do something else with my life, and came across the country in 2001 to volunteer for Olympic National Park and work on their restoration crew. Got my master's in 2007 at UW in Seattle, looking at Elwha Dam removal and how the response might occur naturally. Then they hired me to plan and implement Elwha Dam removal. And I did that up until 2018. Then the Yurok Tribe was obviously interested in the Elwha because of this project, so they recruited me to come down and work here on the Klamath Dam removal project. So there's kind of a short and sweet.
I am glad you started there. Thank you. Wonderful.
So here we are. I've been down here now 2 years, exactly, actually. So I came down in 19 to work on this project, and that's what this talk is about. So I will just dive right into the Klamath Dam removal project. My job is to work on the revegetation, which includes invasive species management, and of course, monitoring the project as we implement. So I'm sure people know about this project down here. I mean, I love talking to native plant people. My favorite audience was always the Olympic Peninsula chapter of the Native Plant Society, because we all could talk the same language. So that was always fun. This project is super complicated, which you guys probably know. It's led by the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, which is a nonprofit organization that was created simply to remove the dams. They hired Kiewit to do the dam removal itself. So that's an engineering firm based out of just north of San Francisco. And also directly underneath KRC is the restoration contract, and that's Resource Environmental Solutions. And that firm, which is based out of Houston and is new to the West Coast, hired the Yurok Tribe to implement revegetation. And then the Yurok Tribe hired me to do that. So as you can see, I'm low on the totem pole. I'm all the way down there. And our job is pretty simple, right? This is a dam removal project. It's really meant to get salmon flowing again upriver, but obviously there's a lot of land that's going to be exposed. So revegetation is very important. And so our job is to make sure native vegetation is established, and with the benefit being that it'll minimize non-natives from establishing. Notice I'm not using the word prevent or eradicate. We know it's going to happen. That was true up in the Elwha. It's definitely going to be true down here. It's even more pressure, which I'll talk about a little later. The vegetation is going to minimize sediment erosion, and of course, we care a lot about salmon and habitat, and as well as the effect that vegetation has on river geomorphology. For those who are new to the project, there are 4 dams on the Klamath. So the Elwha project was 2 dams. It was the largest dam removal in the world. And then I heard about another dam removal project that had 4 dams, and it was going to be 4 times bigger. So God forbid I not be involved in the largest dam removal. I can't have that title taken away. So of course I came down to help here. But this is a lot bigger, right? So we have the J.C. Boyle Dam, which is in Oregon and creates J.C. Boyle Reservoir. It's the smallest of the 3 reservoirs. It's at 3,800 feet in elevation. Then you move quite a long way downstream and you get to Copco, and it's all the way down at about 2,600 feet in elevation. And Copco is the largest of the 3 reservoirs. Then there's Copco 2, which is literally right below Copco 1. And that dam does not really create much of a reservoir. And so there's not much revegetation there. And then we have the Iron Gate Dam, which is at river mile. I can't remember the exact river mile, but it's at 2,200 feet in elevation. There's about 190 miles of river below these reservoirs. And you can see Iron Gate and Copco are pretty close together. The key thing here is there's 13.1 million cubic yards of fine sediment that have accumulated in these reservoirs, mostly in Iron Gate and Copco. J.C. Boyle doesn't have nearly as much. And in some places, we're going to be dealing with 3 to 4, maybe 5 feet of silt and clay that have built up in the reservoirs. In fact, a pretty high proportion of clay. So we're not going to be planting directly into historic soils. We'll be planting into lacustrine, silts and clays, as well as all that algae layers that keep dying and becoming part of the substrate, which is actually quite similar to what we dealt with in the Elwha. What's really unique about this place and pretty fun for me, or for a botanist in general, right, is the diversity. So it's very hot and dry, really different than the Elwha. And really the more hot and dry climate you have, you tend to get more diversity, right? We have a lot of grasslands, although most of the grasslands around these landscapes are not native dominated. But here's a picture of one that is. There are a few out there. There are oak juniper woodlands. They're particularly abundant around Iron Gate. There are lots of chaparral plant communities around Iron Gate and Copco, and there's a lot of chaparral species up at J.C. Boyle. And then J.C. Boyle's predominantly surrounded by ponderosa pine forests. And of course, all of the reservoirs have a lot of riparian forests, and this being the most important piece of the project, since this is primarily focused on salmon restoration. Okay, plant propagation. So how are we going to revegetate? What are we going to use? Let's start with just talking about the native species selection. So how do we pick what we're going to select? And this is a question I often get from students, and it's a tricky question. It really, you do want to find the ideal, the species that should be there, right? For your perfect habitat type, but it doesn't always work that way. So that's sort of represented in this first point here, your observed species patterns. And so if you find a species pattern that is representative of what you're trying to go for, you obviously want to select species from there. They're going to do well in the area. But then the next little piece there is very important, and that's seed availability. Are you going to be able to find a seed? And can you collect enough to then initiate some significant level of propagation? I don't think I mentioned this yet, but we have, it's a total of about 2,000 acres. So that's a lot of acreage. And then you have to consider if it's feasible to propagate. Can you actually turn this into a large scale seed increase field? Can you propagate it into a bare root plant or a container grown plant? Or, maybe you're going to create plugs. And then you want to consider, well, am I doing all this work, but it's going to establish naturally? That's an important variable. And what we look at there is, are the species that we're going to collect capable of doing long distance dispersal on their own? Will they seed bank? Underwater seed banking is not typical. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but maybe you have a species that can do that. And then, of course, what's the season that the seed or that the plant that you're collecting matures? Because if it happens close to the time that the reservoir is going to be exposed, that's another chance that it could establish. So in other words, maybe it has the ability to disperse long distances, but the maturation season is not appropriate. So therefore, you might want to collect it. An example, so observed patterns, I'm out there. This is a new landscape for me. I'm from up north where it's quite different. And so, those observed patterns are pretty fun. This is a great picture of lupinus microcarpus variety densiflorus, which is yellow, and it is all over Iron Gate. So of course, this is a great plant for us to go after. 1, the seed's highly available. 2, it clearly is happy here. And 3, I really want a lupin. One thing I like to point out in all my talks when we're discussing revegetation after dam removal is this is a primary succession landscape. Nothing is there. It's starting from scratch. This isn't a landscape after a fire where there's a seed bank. This isn't a landscape, after, maybe a landslide or a windstorm. This is starting from scratch. And lupins in most primary successional studies tend to play a big role. So I'm looking for lupins. Seed availability. So here's an example of seed availability. Antelope bitterbrush, Herschia tridentata, can be really tricky to collect. There's plenty of seed usually on the plant, as you can see here, although this isn't a great picture. Sometimes there's a lot more than this. But if you're not out there every single day, that plant will all of a sudden drop all the seed, and you can't necessarily, like acorns, just pick them off the ground. They tend to get very quickly eaten. There'll be a lot of holes in them. So actually 2 years in a row, our attempt to get a volume of this species that we want has been a failure because we just it tends to fall over the weekends, unfortunately. And we've just missed it, or we're collecting something else. We can replace that with other chaparral species, so we tend to do that. So ultimately it's a jigsaw puzzle, right? So you see a species that's very abundant, but you can't get the seed, so you try to look to the next most abundant, right? So we have things like rabbit brush or mock orange. Those 2 species are easy to collect. They tend to hold on to the plants a long time. This year, we saw these 3 species in abundance. So this was a funny year for us. The hot and dry summer led to problems for some species. And then for some reason, these 3 species seeded like crazy, maybe in response to the hot and dry season. So a lot of serviceberry, a lot of desert gooseberry, and the birch leaf mountain mahogany we collected for a solid month, just held onto the plant. We were able to get a lot of seed. Propagation feasibility. So this, is, well, how easy is it to propagate? So the picture on your left is a lomatium. That's Lomatium nudicale. And that species, all the lomatiums I love. I really wanted to propagate a lot of them. They have cultural significance. They're abundant in the oak understory. It's clearly happy in the area. But when you talk to the people who do seed increase for you, it's really hard. It takes 5 years. And for the most part, we don't have 5 years. I have a lot less time. So that one's not really feasible. And then on the right, you'll see that's a picture of Mahonias growing at J. Herbert Stone. And we collected that species. I said, here you go, here's enough seed for 500, and 61 germinated. So, propagation feasibility is going to change your plans quite a bit. And then as far as the likeliness for natural establishment, the most important thing in dam removal is going to be the seed bank. And so I did my master's on looking at the seed bank in the Elwha. I didn't actually see that much, but what I did find were wetland species. So wetland species do tend to allow, their seed is used to being underwater. It tends to last longer and stay viable for long periods of time in the anaerobic conditions. And then after dam removal, despite my thesis saying, well, it's not really going to be very prominent, caryxes and juncuses were everywhere. We had a very strange upland dominated by sedges and rushes with an alder overstory in the uplands, which should have been dry Douglas fir forest. And it was exclusively because of the wetland species that seed banked. And so we expect that, and that's great because they're really hard to grow and they're really hard to get large volumes of seed. You can plant plugs, but of course, 2,000 acres, that'd be a lot of plugs. So letting them do it all by themselves is the solution for wetlands. And this picture, by the way, is actually a study from the Klamath, and they had far more wetland species diversity as well as sheer numbers germinate from their samples than in my thesis. So I'm confident. And actually, we had a drawdown this year, and there was a ton of germination. So I'm confident we're going to have a lot of natural establishment of these wetland species. So we're going to use not just seed, we're going to use a variety of ways of revegetating, right? We're going to use The seed is mostly going to be dedicated to grasses and forbs, but we will plant some acorns directly if we have a good acorn year the year before. We're going to plant some bare root plants, some container plants, live cuttings, salvage material, and of course, the natural regeneration that we expect. We get our seed directly from the watershed. So we try to get it all from the Klamath, but sometimes we just don't have success. Like this year, the Sambucus around Iron Gate just didn't do well. And right on 99, there was an amazing Sambucus, and we collected 15 pounds in 5 minutes. Same elevation, similar climate, that's fine. We consider one watershed over to be acceptable. We do purchase the genetically appropriate seed as well when we can't collect it ourselves. We've already bought a lot of seed from Silva Seed Company up in Roy, where they collect cones from the Klamath area. The BLM via the Rogue Native Plant Partnership. Rogue Native Plant Partnership has been awesome. It's really nice to have that intermediary between the BLM and Res, which is a private company, to be able to purchase some seed, and that's good for BLM and it's good for Klamath. And then we've also got it from BFI Seeds, and then we're also employing some micro growers in the Rogue Valley to grow some small scale seed increase for us. We do have our own seed collection team, which is a luxury. So you'll see here, this is the crew from last year. This is last year. They're all natives. They're Yurok and Karuk tribal members. And to date, we have collected about 1,800 pounds. That's bulk seed from about 89 different species. So graminoids, forbs, trees, and shrubs. Some of that seed goes into further seed production. So 1,800 pounds sounds like a lot. You need a lot more to try to seed 2,000 acres. So we can't do that by wild collecting. So what we do is we provide the seed to all these growers. They then sow a field that's anywhere from 1 acre to 2, 5, depending on the species, and then they harvest off those. We have 48 acres so far, custom fields from our seed in production. There's 5 different vendors growing seed for us in 3 states, including here in the Rogue Valley, J. Irva Stone. They were able to provide us 2 acres for seed increase. We expect anywhere from 45 to 65,000 pounds of seed, and it's basically from 29 species as far as the large scale seed increase. We intend to seed the reservoirs at a rate of around 80 to 100 seeds per square feet, and we're probably going to seed it twice, depending on how things do the first year, but we're going to have enough resources to seed it twice at that rate. And so far, we've had 1 production year. The first fields were established in 2019. They were all perennials, so we had no production in year 1. So year 2 produced 25,000 pounds of seed, which is excellent. We're really happy with that. There's the good years and there's the bad years. I suspect this year is going to be a bad year from the heat dome and the other issues that we've had. So we'll see, but at least we're halfway there, which is good. And then again, I mentioned the micro growers. So that's the small scale seed increase. And I mentioned this in the Rogue Native Plant Partnership meeting earlier this week. Here are some of the species. These are kind of my priority species that I'd love to get growing on a small scale. I already have Greg Carey growing about, he's provided already 14 pounds of clean seed from Lupinus alberfrons. I happen to have known one of the partners, and so I got to know Greg the first year I was down here, and lo and behold, I was visiting him in his house, and he had all these lupins growing up and down his driveway, and I was like, can we have that seed? And he was happy to provide it. So and then, of course, he went crazy and transplanted a bunch of babies that are all over his property and is providing even more each year because he's expanding his field of lupins. The lomatiums, we're really hoping to get going because, again, they're slow going. But the benefit what I like about it and what the Res team is really excited about is providing something to the local community. And so if we can start some of these small scale fields like lomatiums, which are culturally valuable, then, in addition to their ecological value, then over time, other projects can use them. We can keep the fields, you guys can keep the fields going, whoever's growing them. Rogue Native Plant Partnership can help organize that and start banking the seed, and it becomes something available for those last second restoration projects or projects that need more seed than they can collect in the wild. So the bare root container is not going to be a big part of our project, but it is an important part, right? So most of our rooted plants that we're going to introduce are going to be trees and shrubs, and they're going to be predominantly bare root. There are a few species that we're going to grow in containers. For instance, we are growing some oaks out there right now at J. Herbertstone, and they don't do well as a bare root, so they're in a container. And we hope to do acorns, but just to be safe, we're growing some in containers. And we're trying to grow about 250,000. That's actually about 200,000 less than the Elwha. So even though the Elwha was significantly smaller at 1/4 the size, there's just not as much of an investment on this project for rooted plants, which can make some sense. You know, a lot of certainly Iron Gate's going to have a fair amount of grasslands, but we're going to be real strategic with that 250,000 and hopefully have a big impact, even though the number's not as big. And the big concern really is Phytophthora. So, you know, they really didn't want any container grown plants. In fact, when I came on this project, AECOM had said there's not going to be any growing of plants. It's all going to be seed, and that's it, including woodies, which is crazy, a little not too smart. And the reason I say that is, you know, we've tried sowing woody species directly, it never works, and they're very important. And if you can get them in there early, they're going to have a huge impact on the successional trajectory of your site. So it's really important to do that. We are going to do some herbaceous plugs. You know, I mentioned there probably wetland species are going to take care of themselves. But just to be safe, we are going to grow some wetland species for some of these palustrine wetlands that we expect to occur. But we're also going to do it for some upland species that are important pollinators, like the Asclepias. We are going to do some rhizomes. Rhizomes are the best for Asclepias, but you know, so some of that takes a long time, right? So if there's not an established field with the right genetics, it just takes too long. So we're going to try to grow some as plugs. We'll probably grow potentially some lupins as plugs and some penstemon. Lupins tend to not do so great in plugs, and they do really well as seed. But penstemon will be another one, and we have a lot of penstemons out there. It's pretty awesome around Iron Gate in May to go look at all the penstemons. Live stakes and pole cuttings. I'm going to cruise through these slides. I think most people are probably familiar with live stakes. Pole cuttings are basically a big live stake. That's the only difference. They're going to be mostly used along the rivers, obviously. These are super valuable. It's all about your source. So hopefully we can find enough to get 25,000+. And they're all going to be cut from willows and cottonwoods, although we could, if we have some red osier, dogwood, we'll do that. And actually spireas and snowberry do well as cuttings too. We will do some salvaging. The prior planners thought salvaging would be super awesome and a big part of the project, but salvaging is very expensive. It's not particularly useful if it's if you're confined. In other words, they were like, oh, just go along the whole rim and pull stuff up. And yeah, super rocky, hard to get to, and it's not going to give us much source. But if there's a place where we have the equipment and it's a site that we know is not going to survive the drawdown, then yes, we'll salvage and move things into its appropriate new habitat. All right, so we've got the plant materials, going to understand a little bit about all the different habitat types. So how are we going to actually implement? Most of the landscape's going to be seeded. I say most because we're going to leave 10% exposed as a control. Control is super important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the discussion. We will seed by hand. When I came down here, they wanted to employ a helicopter, and as the reservoir drew down, they were going to have a helicopter cruising along, and then park, and the next day the same thing. This is a picture you'll see on the left there. That's from the Elwha. We did it all by hand. It was easy to walk out on the landscape during drawdown. It's a little bit mucky. You wait a day or two, you're fine. We actually seeded a year later and we were fine. We don't want to do that here, but the point being, it's totally doable and it's way more accurate. Seed is super valuable resource, and having people who can actually direct where it goes and make sure it gets to where we're going in a good mix is a better situation, and it employs more people. So instead of the money going all to the helicopter operator, it goes to usually 10 people. We will modify the seed mixes for elevation and habitat, and essentially we'll have a wetland riparian mix and an upland mix. That's going to be a base mix, right? So the whole place will get a base upland mix where there's uplands and a base wetland riparian mix. And again, we're going to seed twice potentially, certainly year one, as soon as possible after drawdown, and then a year later, depending on how things respond in year one. We will potentially seed for 2 to 6 years after. So you'll notice I said year zero, that's during drawdown. Year one is a year later. 2 to 6 is the maintenance and monitoring period. We are contracted to continue work for 5 years after the 2-year implementation. And so depending on how things perform, we could be doing more seeding and planting. So here's a picture of what those seeded areas look like. So here's Copco Reservoir, and here's what we think are going to be the zones. This is our effort at trying to estimate how much acreage we're going to need for uplands and riparian and then palustrine wetlands, so wetlands that aren't tied to the river. This is based on bathymetry and is conceptual. So things are going to be different. It's not going to be exactly like this. As far as the rooted trees and shrubs, this is meant to sort of supplement all that seeding, right? And get some of these important tree and shrub communities going immediately in year zero. And of course, trees and shrubs are really good for enhancing slope stability. So herbaceous plants and stuff that grow from seed are good at surficial erosion control, but then you're going to have this interesting break between the sediments and the historic soils, and you don't want that to fail on a steep slope. And so wherever you can get some deep-rooted species established, you're going to have more slope stability. And of course, it's going to accelerate succession for some of these key habitat types, which are really important for fauna. And in some cases, of course, we'll plant the herbaceous plugs. And really, that is all about the pollinator piece. Everyone's concerned about enhancing the pollinator habitat. And again, some of these species, we're just going to have more success introducing as a plug to make sure it gets established and provide that immediate pollinator resource. We will plant pretty much right during drawdown. So there's a picture of us doing it in the Elwha. There's a Elwha Klamath tribal member planting. And actually, you don't see it in the picture, but just to the right is the reservoir. We were boating to this location and getting out of the boat, and every day the reservoir was a little lower, so it was a little harder to get to where we were planting. So again, you can definitely do it while the reservoir is drawing down. One of the issues we have in the Klamath, so the Elwha, when it was drawn down, it was drawn down. There was no way it was going to fill up again because it was done from the top down. The Klamath is not going to be done from the top down. And so our drawdown schedule is going to influence where we plant because they're going to totally drain the reservoir, but because it's going to be more of a bottom up process of removal, a spring flood could then refill the reservoir depending on how much flow is coming. And so we're going to need to be cognizant of where that level could potentially refill, and we don't want to put resources where we think we might lose them because of that. So that's going to, and we'll know better as we get closer to the drawdown schedule. But planting during drawdown is super important because there's a lot of moisture. In the Elwha, we found that plants that were put in the ground during the drawdown compared to a year later had a way higher rate of survival. I don't remember the number offhand, but we had something like overall was 92% survival of 5 different species that we were tracking that survived during the year of drawdown. We never had that number again in any other year. And here, where it's hot and dry, as you can imagine, that's even more important. We can't irrigate 2,000 acres. So getting stuff in the ground while there's this residual moisture because it had been a lake is really valuable. We're going to put most of our plantings in prioritized areas. So, and these are tributaries that are really important to salmonids, and we're calling them high priority restoration areas. But we're also going to be planting outside of those in distinct clusters that I call facilitation patches. So the high priority restoration areas are, here's an example of one. So this, you're looking here at Jenny Creek. So Jenny Creek, Mason Creek, right, goes through the monument, goes underneath 66, and then makes it down into California and into the Iron Gate Reservoir. And so this is probably the most valuable salmon habitat tributary in the whole project. And so you'll see these are the boundaries for our restoration area. We're going to put a lot more resources into this kind of place, right? We're going to fence it so cattle can't get in. So that's really valuable for revegetation. We are going to employ irrigation in these high priority restoration areas. So those two resources will only occur at least during implementation in these high priority restoration areas. And they might not be the whole area, but they'll be used strategically as we see fit, as we can implement it in there. Sometimes the topography makes that difficult. The other idea I mentioned earlier is the facilitation patches. So what is a facilitation patch? That is a distinct planting area, right? That is essentially, you pack in your resources, right? So there's a picture of how it looks. So what I'm imagining in that picture is, let's say that's a half acre, maybe it's an acre. And you put all your plants together in these clusters, right? Really densely. When I came down here, they were like, here's the reveg plan. We're going to plant only 250,000 plants. And to cover the whole area, we're going to spread them all out really far apart, like 20 feet apart. And I'm like, well, that's, you just, might as well kiss them all goodbye, right? So when you put them all together, you actually get what's called facilitation. And there's a lot of literature about facilitation, and it's particularly important in hot and dry places. So deserts are well known for plants facilitating one another, surviving in that difficult environment. And the way it works is by being closer to more plants, particularly before you're at a point where you're competitive, competing with each other. You have evapotranspiration is slowed down because everybody is passively moving water through the plant, right? And so the environment in that immediate vicinity of a dense stand of plants is more humid than in an area that's out, where a plant's all by itself 20 feet away from the next plant. And when you're really young, that's very important for your survival, right? Humidity, that's going to slow down your evapotranspiration rate. So these clusters will have an increased plant survival. If it's dense enough, you'll minimize herbivory. And of course, you'll get shade more quickly, and there's a lot less likelihood that non-native species will establish. So when you see IEV, that's invasive exotic vegetation. And that's a lot less likely to happen in a dense stand. And of course, there's another benefit when you're a manager, and that is you don't have to manage 2,000 acres and wonder how your plants are doing by walking every 20 feet. It's all clustered in one place. And if you do need to put irrigation down or mulch or anything else, you can do it much more effectively, much more cost effectively. Your resource doesn't have to be spread out. And in there, we're going to have the bare root plants, the container plants, herbaceous plugs, but also we'll modify our seed mixes. And so here's an example of how this gets employed on the landscape. This is a picture of Iron Gate Reservoir. So where you see the photos, that's not underwater right now, but where you see these colors, that's the reservoir with our base seed mix that I mentioned earlier. And then you have these polygons, right? So here you have an oak woodland facilitation patch and a native grassland facilitation patch. And you'll notice these are hugging the shoreline. And this is a different approach than what we did in the Elwha. We ignored the buffer from the shoreline because we knew it was going to seed itself. Well, here we want to kind of do the opposite. Here we want to start our clusters close because one, oak woodlands, for instance, really have a lot of underground activity going that's very important to its survival. So by putting by growing our oaks close to that existing woodland, we potentially could get that underground benefit more quickly than if we were to place it far away. The other benefit is, you end up with a patch that's not isolated from movement of plants and animals, right? So the existing oak woodland plants might then disperse more readily into whatever we can't introduce in our patch. And it increases the size of this oak woodland, which is a good thing. Same thing for this native grassland. There's a plot right here with an amazing native grassland. These are super rare around Iron Gate. So I love the idea of trying to expand its patch size into the reservoir with these facilitation patches. Okay, so invasive exotic vegetation management. So that's every time you see IEV, that's what I'm talking about, invasive exotic vegetation. That was a new term for me. Never heard that before. That's how they were calling it. That's what they were calling it down here. So I'm rolling with it. It's kind of a nice way to, it rolls off the tongue, IEV, right? I don't know. Okay, so obviously we are trying to minimize establishment. And like I mentioned before, we have no delusion that we're going to be able to eradicate or prevent. So we're trying to minimize it. And it starts by trying to prevent whatever is existing from getting into the reservoirs, right? So there's a pre-dam removal piece. Part of that pre-dam removal piece is to focus on access roads and staging areas. So, which is not just pre-dam removal. That's something that occurs during and after. So keeping those access roads and staging areas free of invasive species is critical to making sure that we aren't the ones introducing the invasive species. And then really the essential piece is early detection and rapid response. And there's where we can eradicate, right? So in the reservoir, we're not going to eradicate long-term, but we can eradicate for a while, potentially, depending on what happens with the seed bank. But that's the goal, is to get in there and respond quickly and prevent, which is realistic in a place that has nothing. There might be a seed bank, and I imagine the seed bank's going to have this bad guy, as well as, which is teasel, as well as reed canary grass and wetland species that are problematic. So how do we determine who is the bad guy and who's not? This is a contentious topic, one that I don't think we have perfected as ecologists, but the process that we've used, we have identified 53 species. I will tell you right now, they are not necessarily perfectly identified as being the problems, and I will be adaptively managing that list every year. When we mapped the project land was mapped before I came down here, and they provided the map to us, and there was only 23 of the 53 species that were considered important to be present. So the 30 species that we have not observed, or that were not observed prior to me coming down, and I haven't seen them either since I've been down here, we're going to keep them on a list. Those are the ones that we actually can potentially eradicate. If they're not here now and we happen to come across a population, that becomes the highest priority, right? Because then you could actually eradicate, which is an awesome opportunity. And so then we took that list of 23 species and we tried to figure out how can we treat them and what's the prioritization for treating them? Because I've got a landscape the size of Delaware and a crew of 5. So I'm not going to be able to treat everything everywhere. So we have to prioritize treatment in addition to the species prioritization we went through. And so what we decided to do is we looked at, okay, abundance, right? And then control opportunities. Can we eradicate it? Yes, no. In other words, is it a big population, or is there only one single population out there that we know of? Or is it so abundant that we can only do containment? And then also another thing to consider with eradication or containment is how well does it respond to treatment? And the way we identified if it was possible to eradicate was we looked at abundance, and it was just, you knew you had a high chance if there was 0 to 25 observations, medium, and then low, right? So, again, I don't like the word eradication, but it is important to consider because it can change your priorities when you know there aren't that many on the landscape. Containment is the idea of just limiting that spread, right? So they're way too abundant for us to eradicate. And so we're going to do what's called containment. And that's based on the feasibility for species, that you could actually control. If you can't even control them, then you're not even going to be able to contain them at all if you have no method to control. And the way we looked at that was proximity of populations to our restoration sites, particularly to our high priority restoration sites. The likelihood of control, right? So how do we control them? And then seed dispersal mechanism. How is it going to disperse? Is it going to go fast, slow? Is it really good at it? How does it move around? And that list provided, that process is how we came up with this eradication or containment control opportunity list. And that was tied to our priority list. And that gave us, kind of our top bad guys, and then our intermediate bad guys, which, that doesn't necessarily mean some of these aren't worse than others, but just a way to manage them. An example of containment is the 3 worst bad guys out there are cheatgrass, medusa head, and star thistle, as I'm sure all of you know. They're all everywhere. You can never eradicate them. They are well beyond our ability to control. They're on private lands. They're right up against the reservoir edge. However, when you think about their mechanism for movement, it has good news and bad news. They all are epizoochorous seed dispersal plants, which means they attach to the outside of critters and move long distances that way. They don't disperse long distances in the wind, and they don't get eaten to disperse long distances. They don't get eaten, and no one wants to eat them. The cattle aren't eating them. Instead, they're moving them around on their hooves. So when we consider that, we think, well, maybe we could potentially control them, right? Because without humans and animals, they're not going to go very far. So if we create a buffer around the reservoirs, just to give our native seed a breathing room until we're no longer able to manage, the area, we're not going to be here forever, then everything will get established. It'll be a lot harder for invasion to occur. And the way we were originally proposing to do that was to mow. Mowing can be challenging. I don't remember. Yeah, mowing can be really challenging. They all will respond to mowing. However, they have different timing, right? So you have cheatgrass goes first, medusa heads flowers second, and then star thistles quite late. And guess what? They all live together in the same patches. So this year we gave it a whirl. We tried mowing. And so we established polygons in some priority locations. We had our crews, we gave them weed whackers, and we established a 50-foot buffer. 100 feet was not realistic. And then we mowed it. This one that you're looking at here is near Wanaka Springs, and it got mowed 4 to 5 times, depending on where you're standing on the landscape. This is what it looked like. Here's a medusa head patch, pretty pure medusa head as far as the eye can see. There's my crew. So we didn't just assume it was going to work or not work. So we put down plots before we mowed, and had the crew learn how to do vegetation plots, and then looked at it in between mows, and then looked at it after we mowed. And one of the things that we now noticed was that the native species abundance in these plots was near 0 in some places. These plots were almost exclusively non-native and almost exclusively invasive non-native. Let's see here. There we go. Seemed to be frozen for a second there. So there's a before picture of one of our mowing plots. This is a cheatgrass plot. There were all 3 species were there, but the cheatgrass was the most abundant. And this is what it looked like after. So the idea is that, these are annuals. We just prevent them from going to seed. And then you're supposed to do that for 3 years, right? To try to exhaust the seed bank. Seed bank tends to last 2 to 5 years, depending on the species. What we did find, and here's another picture that's kind of looking at a bigger, broader landscape view of Wanaka Springs. What we did find was cheatgrass seed heads were reduced by 97% on that plot that you were looking at, just the before and after site. Medusa head seeds were reduced by about 88%, so that's pretty good. However, it was totally useless for star thistle. Star thistle just kept resprouting. It wasn't ever flowering when we started the mows. And so by the last mow, there was some flowers coming up, but we'd weed whack it and then came back a month later, couldn't keep weed whacking because of the fire season. And so we came back a month later, it didn't look like we had mowed at all when it came to star thistle. So the star thistle, it was useless, particularly because of our fire season. This is what it looked like. This is one of our mowed sites. You can't tell that we were there. So mowing kind of out the window. We're not going to do that, but we are still going to create these buffer zones. The way we're going to do that is a combination. We did do a lot of grubbing because we couldn't mow where there's a lot of native vegetation. We didn't want to do that. So here's one of my crew members actually mowing in between lupins and willows, grubbing, not mowing. And grubbing's great because you do it once and it's gone, right? It's just, how do you grub 23 miles of shoreline? So our new plan is to shorten the buffer length to make it a little more realistically to grub and potentially do some mowing and a little bit of herbicide, right? And that way, if we do all of these things together and then potentially plant it when we're done, areas that, had no native vegetation, then we're going to have a lot, our buffer is going to be a kind of a physical buffer of plantings combined with the grubbing that we do in between those for at least 2 to 3 years. And we can end up with a healthy shoreline that's not going to become an immediate problem for our plantings. We're also changing our list. So I mentioned earlier that I'll be adaptively managing that list. That first list that you saw was complete digital world list, doing research and studies. But when you get out on the landscape, it's a different beast. And we did our own mapping. Here's a picture of a stretch of Iron Gate. So this is kind of near, Iron Gate's a long reservoir, it's 9 miles. And based on our experience, we're reducing our list of what we're going to manage to 10. And here's an example of that. So you'll see there's only 3 species. We did not try to map the star thistle, medusa head, and cheatgrass. We just basically said it's the whole shoreline, and it basically is. So we're going to manage those. Those are the part of the 10. Those are 3 of the 10. And then we have these 3, the teasel, the Dipsacus fallenum, reed canary grass, and Himalayan blackberry. And as you can see, they're pretty common along all the shorelines of all the reservoirs. We can't manage them everywhere, right? So we have to prioritize where we're going to manage them. And we're really going to look at areas that are most likely, particularly with the reed canary grass and the teasel, that the areas that are most likely going to have access to the future riparian areas. So either the tributary riparian or the main stem or some palustrine wetland. And so J.C. Boyle then pops out as a manager as having your biggest threat for invasives, because that whole this whole upper reservoir is actually only gonna the river is only about 10 feet lower than the shoreline, and so there's going to be a lot of pretty good floodplain habitat for all these teasel points to just move on in. So if they're not seed banking underwater, which they probably are, they're going to move. So we've already been working on this shoreline. This whole stretch, a lot of it got grubbed, and what they couldn't grub, they cut. And so by cutting the heads, we're stopping it from seeding this year. It's a biennial, and we cut twice. So and remove the heads with the idea that we're not letting it seed this year, and then next year we'll probably have a herbicide program in place, because the best way to treat it is when it's a rosette, and you can gently spray it, and it's gone, and it's not a problem. And that's the most cost-effective way of doing it. And reed canary grass is a big concern up there, particularly for BLM, which has a big stake in this project. But really the key is early detection and rapid response, right? It's what you do in the reservoirs after drawdown. And it's the most critical time for this kind of project. Remember, it's primary succession. There's nothing there. So whatever germinates from a seed bank is your biggest threat, right? For having widespread presence. But after that, it's just being on top of what comes in from the outside, which of course the river is going to move a lot of things. So the riparian zone will always be challenging. But how are we going to do early detection and rapid response? We're going to make sure everyone's trained in identifying IAV species, particularly when they're little babies. That can be really challenging. So we take pictures, we create guides for how to identify these things. We're going to walk the reservoir footprints multiple times each year. We did that in the Elwha. It's very effective. and that helps shape our IEV treatment plans each year. And then we'll look at those patterns of infestations. If we see something that seems to be repeating itself, well, then we have to look at where it's coming from and potentially go there and take action. We will mostly mechanically remove things because early on, that's the easiest, and everyone wants us to be minimal with our herbicide use, as do we, right? In fact, the tribe has a mandate within their borders to not use herbicide. They're not comfortable with herbicide, so we're going to do as much mechanical removal as possible. We're also going to make sure everybody beyond just the restoration folks are savvy with IEV species. So that includes the kiewit team, the fisheries biologists, whoever else is doing any kind of work out there, that they have an understanding of these species. So having an annual sit down with these folks, giving them the materials to identify these things and empowering them to then pull it and remove it. And we'll do the same thing with the public. So hopefully the public eventually sees us as good guys and not bad guys down there. Right now we're bad guys. But once there's no dams anymore, I imagine that they'll see us as the good guys because we're making sure it looks nice, right? And it's not some mud pit. So having an awareness campaign with the public is really valuable. Educational flyers highlighting the species you want them to remove, and then having dispersal units readily available, a garbage can, that says IEV species, and having our crew, maintain them. I know we'll end up with dealing with other trash, but I think it's going to be worth the headache to allow people to just throw away. Because when you pull a plant, you got to get it out of there, right? I mean, most of the time, depends on the species. All right, so I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I have a few more slides to discuss monitoring and maintenance. So a lot of projects don't get to do monitoring, right? Well, in the Elwha, we got to do 7 years of monitoring, and here we are going to do something very similar, which is pretty awesome. So monitoring the reservoirs is really important to most of the regulators, in fact, right? And they want to make sure that we're doing what we said we're going to do. And we're going to do this with a combination of quantitative and qualitative. So things that you can analyze statistically and write a paper on, and then stuff that's more quantitative, but tends to actually be more valuable on a day-to-day adaptive management approach. So the quantitative methods are really geared towards success criteria, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So those are things that are kind of being forced upon us to establish by all the regulators. And then the quantitative stuff's really for me more than it is for them, although I can certainly use it and present it to the regulators as well. So the quantitative are permanent plots, and we have different kinds. We have reference plots. Those are plots outside of the reservoirs. We started doing those this year. They are the plots that are telling us what the standard vegetation characteristics are in the surrounding communities, and those end up establishing our success criteria. So if we can match some of those metrics, then we know we're successful, or we'll never match them exactly in the time period, but we'll be heading in that direction. The plots within the reservoir, we're calling reservoir plots, and there's two types. There's the treated plots, stratified by habitat type. So those are plots that have been seeded and or planted, or both. Well, either they're going to be seeded and planted, or they're going to be just seeded. And then we're going to have what I mentioned earlier, and that's the control plots, areas in the reservoirs that we leave alone so that we can look at those to see. That's more important than the reference plots in my mind, right? Because maybe we take all this action, but it's not meeting the metrics that we established, in these oak woodlands, which, it's only been 7 years. That's probably likely. But let's compare them to where we did nothing and see how different they are and how valuable our work was. We also will do some IEV treatment plots like what we did this year to make sure that what we're treating is effective, right? We don't want to just treat and walk away and assume it worked. And there'll probably be some level of digital monitoring. Everyone's really into that. That can be super useful, particularly along the river. So I imagine the river vegetation development can really be effectively monitored digitally. The success criteria we've established there's 4. Cover vegetation. So we want to see it progressing each year, right? More cover each year. and we want it to be dominated by natives. We want good species richness. So species richness will have some number as a target for the different vegetation types. We like richness over diversity. It's easier to measure. It tends to get closer to, there's a lot of literature out there now about how species richness is really important to long-term ecosystem function and sustainability. So it's a lot more resilient if you have richness. And diversity sometimes doesn't capture that because sometimes you have some real dominant species that kind of wash out some of the rare plants that tend to take over function after a disturbance. So they really were important, even though they didn't really rise up to a level of importance in the diversity metric. Woody plant densities, that's our effort of saying survival. So instead of survival, we don't really care that much. What matters more is the number of plants that are living, representative of what we think it should be, right? So that way you can get overplant. Maybe you only have 50% survival, it's hot and dry, but guess what? You overplanted to make sure that you had the density you wanted after 4 or 5 years. And then of course, exotic plant abundance. And I did not use the term IEV here. I can exchange it, but really I care about the relative abundance of natives to non-natives in general. That's me personally. The regulators care mostly about those species we've identified as problematic, but I want to make sure that all our native dominance is sustainable. And I can explain that if anyone has any questions. So I'm putting this slide up again just because I wanted to explain the uncontrolled, unplanted control area. 10% of the landscape, I'm going to try to put them in places that people don't see because they could be ugly. They will regenerate naturally. Whether or not they become invasive is hard to say. I probably wouldn't put one right here where I did this because I know this is a Medusa head field. I just did that as an example. So I'll try to find spots that are healthier. We can't put our facilitation patches everywhere. There's a oak woodland, so an oak woodland spot would be good because the oak woodlands, based on our reference plot data that we have this year, seems to have a lot better native abundance than these grasslands, with the exception of this really cool one that I found. So we'll place them strategically, but again, they're very important. Qualitative monitoring is something like this. So we map the reservoirs for invasive species, and this is what we did in the Elwha. So here you're looking at Lake Mills after dam removal, and every year the crew would go out, and I would make them track themselves, right, with the GIS unit. So I knew where they walked, and they would cruise around, and whenever they ran into an invasive species, they'd take a point. That's considered a qualitative method of monitoring, but you could actually transform it into something quantitative, and it's really effective, and it's not hard. You can do it. I had my one of my field ecologists mapped the Iron Gate Reservoir. I think it took them like 3 days. Employ some people, get them to walk it, and they'll get a good idea, and they can pull as they go. And then photo monitoring is really valuable. So landscape scale photos, there's two kinds. There's gonna be landscape scale photo monitoring, like this picture, right? And this is actually the drawdown from last year. So you can see a bit of the reservoirs exposed here. And then there's gonna be the plot photos. So here's an example of a landscape scale photo on the Elwha. So here's Mills during the dam removal, and then a few years post. So here's this one's 2012 during dam removal, and you can see where the shoreline was all the way up here. And as you progress, here's the dam. Now the dam's gone. This is 2013. There's still a little bit of dam. So it looks like a river, but there's still some dam. There's just so much sediment. It's backed up behind the dam. Here it is in 14. It wasn't until August that it was fully removed, but you can see some removal occurred, hence this bank. So the river is actually dropped in elevation. And what's more important, you can see a lot of green. This is the fine sediments at Mills. And so you can see it on the landscape scale starting to develop just a couple of years after it's been exposed. Here it is in 15, and you can see it's even greener. Now there's no dam at all. The river's a little lower, and there's some vegetation on these terraces. There it is in 16, and then 17, and do I think I have an 18? No, All right, there's 18, 17. That's the last one. These were fixed cameras that provide a really good landscape scale view of what happened. Res is going to do this. We want to do this on Iron Gate. We want to do this on Copco, and we want it to be on the internet for people to watch and see. And it's really a nice way to see the progression. The plot photos are also awesome, right? These can really provide a on the ground view of change. So here's an example of the Elwha. So we're going to do these exact same plots, right? So here's a line intercept. The line intercept is designed to look at the changes in bare ground over time. And here's what the Elwha look like. There's the little juncuses and calyxes that germinate from the seed bank. And there's the fine sediment. See it cracking? It's really similar to the sediments here in the Klamath. Here's 2012. There it is in 13. There you can see the rushes are blooming. Here it is in 14. You can see the alders starting to pop up. And there it is in 15. And before long, it's a forest, which we're not expecting here. But you can obviously get a nice sense of vegetation development with these repeat photos. And so just wanted to make a quick mention that obviously if we are not meeting our success criteria, we will have a system for assessing why that is. If vegetation is not doing well, what's going on? And the first thing I want to do is look at those control plots that I mentioned that are in the reservoir that have not been seeded or planted. And then are the numbers going in the right direction? So maybe it doesn't look great. We're not hitting these targets, but we're seeing progress each year. Well, then and maybe the control plots are doing terribly. So then the regulators would consider potentially changing those targets to determine whether or not, we've been successful. And if necessary, we will obviously take measures to fix things, which, include, I don't know if I have a slide. So we'll take action. We'll monitor those sites after the remedial action is taken. Yes, and then of course, we potentially could reseed, replant. We will start employing irrigation strategically if necessary. Hence, I like the idea of these facilitation patches. We might change our IUV control methods if needed, let alone the idea of mulching, compost, or some other natural nutrient additive, and fencing, which might actually be the most important thing. The cattle out there are a nightmare. So that was my almost last slide. This is my slide to say, I am not the person on the ground, they are. And so I want a shout out to the tribal members that are here. This is their land. They are very proud of this work and they are in it for the long haul, which is pretty exciting because it's a seasonal job, but they are awesome. And I want to make sure they get a shout out. So if I have time, I guess I could take questions. I'm not sure what time.
Yeah, we can ask folks who are still here with us. So let's go ahead and ask some of those questions. Vanessa did make it in. She was in the field, and I'll let you interrupt if you want to take over on the questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to go forward, Vanessa, either way.
You got it, Rachel.
Okay, let's see. Let me zoom back here.
And hi, Josh. Sorry, folks. Sorry for my tardiness.
No worries.
Caught out of range. It can happen around here. That was a great presentation. Fascinating. It's going to be so interesting to see it transform. Such an interesting landscape already. So yeah, really exciting. We've got some good questions here. So let's see. So first of all, you talked about the wetland species in the Elwha coming up everywhere. Did they come up evenly, or were they kind of like more along the edges, or were they also down in the deep water areas?
So that's where, so my thesis showed them only being in the shallow areas, right? So that's what I was expecting, but no, they were everywhere.
Okay.
It ended up being really like everywhere and fast. And well, I shouldn't say super fast. So like if you walked around on the landscape in 2012, they're a little spotty, which you kind of noticed in that first slide. But like by 2013, a year later, they were then everywhere. So I think they're just, and I think those who've worked with seeding wetland species, they know this. Seeds, the wetland species, they just germinate when they feel like it. Like they could be slow. They can stay viable a long time and just sit there. And so Eventually it was everywhere, and they were the most abundant plants even after 7 years of monitoring. They started fading in year 7. I mean, they were already dying back, but they still were the most dominant genus just from their presence early on. But long term, they weren't going to be a part of that landscape.
Right.
It was fleeting, but still positive. All right. I mean, they provided some organics and broke up the sediment, and there's nothing. They were native, so that's nature doing her thing.
Right. Let's see. Will the BLM or Forest Service be seeding grazing grasses over this area?
No.
Oh, good.
No, they all want the grazing out. They wanted us to fence all 3 reservoirs in its entirety. But then there'd be no money for dam removal. That's how expensive it is.
Okay, yeah. And there was a question, you mentioned cattle. Do you have a strategy to deal with the wild horses around the Iron Gate?
No, our only strategy is, again, to fence in those high priority areas, and those fences will be horse and cattle fencing, I think. I'm not sure. That's a res question, but the horses are going to be challenging. There's a lot of horses. I see them frequently out there.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
Some people love them, but all the ecologists are like,
Yeah, they're cute. My daughter thinks they're cute.
Right. In the spring, there are all the babies. So after the dam removal, who will own the land that is currently underwater? That was a question I had too. Is that?
I don't know if it's been entirely settled. I think in California and potentially CDFW. I'm not sure what's going to happen in Oregon. People ask me that in the Elwha too, and it's still not been dispersed up there. And that.
Oh, interesting.
Anniversary.
Wow, that's really interesting. There isn't an answer to that question.
Yeah, it's going to be slow wherever it is.
Right.
Slow process and probably ugly.
I hope not. We don't need that.
Everything in the Klamath is kind of ugly.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, it's the Klamath, of course. Of course, it's messed up.
Yeah. I feel for you being down there. I mean, I'm interested to go down there and explore, and it seems like a challenging environment for this kind of project politically.
Yes.
You mentioned this stuff going on underground under the oaks, and you were probably talking about the mycorrhizal activity associated with the oaks. Is that?
Yes, the wood wide web.
Right.
Yeah, the mycorrhizae, and there's probably lots of other stuff we're not aware of, but they have found there's a lot of activity underground in the oak woodlands that are really critical to oaks. And I don't know all the details, but it's pretty. At this point, the patch approach, it's kind of an old idea. It's called the Bradley method of restoration, where you try to find an existing healthy thing that you want to restore and build off it. And so I want to employ that regardless of the underground, above ground relationships, but I think it speaks to that as well.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And I agree that there's probably even more than we're discovering. It's we've got lots to learn. So Stacy Johnson says, this is a phenomenal project and a great presentation. Looking forward to hearing about and watching the restoration process. And then what is the land ownership around the reservoirs now? Do you know that?
Yes, I do know that. I have to know that because it's complicated. Iron Gate is pretty, there's a nice, pretty broad ownership by Pacificor. So that's where we do most of our work, and we have the easiest time because it's Pacificor land. There's some BLM land. We have permissions with them too. And there's some CDFW land, like a Horseshoe Ranch area. And so we have a great relationship with them as well. Copco is entirely owned privately. Copco is a pain in the butt. They do not like us. They were harassing my IEV mapper, and he was in the water, mapping legally on the shoreline, and he was harassed. That's going to be problematic. JC Boyle is almost entirely owned by Green Diamond. So, and they're great. They're an amazing partner. The direct shoreline is Pacificor, but all the lands around it, for long distances are Green Diamond. There's a chunk owned by the county, Klamath County, and we haven't really dealt with that side much. That's where all the cattle are. well, the cattle are everywhere. They're on Green Diamond too. That's the worst cattle presence is JC Boyle.
And what is Green Diamond, or is it a ranch or a?
Green Diamond is a forestry,
Forestry,
private
okay.
forestry company, and they've been super easy to work with. And one day they were out with their head honchos, and they stopped and asked what we were doing, and they were super excited. They're like pro dam removal. They want to have a good relationship. They're awesome. We were really happy to interact with them.
Nice. Let's see. So that I think was all the questions from our participants. I had a couple more. I was wondering, in the presentation you were just in the other day, somebody mentioned cultural sites being kind of revealed, and I was wondering if the tribes have any cultural sites that are currently underwater that you know of.
I bet they do. I don't know of any. And again, that'd probably be a Shasta question. And so I know there's a cultural piece to this whole project, and there's a whole document dedicated to it. I don't know that it's out there yet in the public. I haven't been involved with it, so I'm not sure what it says, but I'm guessing there's a fair amount of cultural history under these reservoirs.
Yeah. Let's see. And I think there was a question that I feel like I missed in there, but I had a related one. It was just sort of about the level of work with this kind of a project. How much work does that take? But the other kind of piece of it was, I was wondering if you intend to reach out for volunteer help at all. I mean, whether it's the Native Plant Society type folks or other volunteer organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Resource Environmental Services, is a little sticker shocked by the seed collection. So we have to continue seed collecting. There's never going to be an end. And so, it's great that we've had this crew for 3 years. I'm not going to be able to keep them just collecting seed in the future. And so what we hope to do is yes, employ volunteers, both native volunteer or events, but also through the Rogue Native Plant Partnership.
Great.
And it would be, when we know there's like all the lupin is, the seed is ready, and we need 15 sets of hands out there. Or the oaks are, ready to get the oaks, that's when we're going to ask for volunteers. And we also want to have volunteers help with seed cleaning. And I'm sure there'll be opportunities for planting and potentially seeding. That can be a little trickier. We did run a lot of that up at the Elwha. It worked out fine. So it just depends on, the time of year and what's going on.
Right. Well, cool. I'm sure we'll be in the loop and hear about that and help facilitate with spreading the word about that as much as possible.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So wonderful. Great. Such a good effort. Really looking forward to seeing it. Thank you for sharing with us. And I don't think we have any more questions. So in a few days, we'll get this recording up onto the YouTube, and if people registered, they'll get a link for it. Otherwise, they're always up there on the YouTube. So thanks so much, Joshua. I really appreciate it.
Me too. I look forward to doing this in
work.
person someday. I can actually see people laugh, and maybe they laughed, maybe they weren't laughing.
I was laughing. I was going to I should put smiles up for you. Yeah.
It's so hard. Zoom world is not the same.
I know it. Oh God. I know. It's always right. But you were in television, so maybe that's some kind of a preparation. That was,
I guess. I was behind the camera.
You were behind the camera. Those are some nice pictures. Are those your pictures?
Yeah. All the photos in the show. Yeah, that's me. I wanted to be a filmmaker. I was the camera guy.